Imagine waking up in a world far removed from anything we know today, a world where comfort and security are nothing more than distant ideas, reserved only for the elite few. A world where survival is not a given, but a daily challenge. This is the world of Dark Age Britain, a place where the air is heavy with the smell of dampness and decay, where the simple act of surviving another day is both a struggle and a triumph. The year is somewhere around the 5th century, after the Romans have left, and the old world has crumbled. The shadows of their empire have long disappeared, leaving behind a fractured land, riddled with uncertainty and danger. At this time, life is not guaranteed. It is fragile, like the thatched roofs of homes that can barely shield their inhabitants from the harsh realities of the environment. You wake in a hut, a small, dimly lit space shared with your family, livestock, and the ever-present smell of damp straw. The floor is hard and cold, made of dirt, and the roof, made of reeds, leaks with every rainfall. The crack of dawn finds you groggy, your back sore from the previous night's sleep, if you could even call it sleep. It's hard to feel rested when you're lying on a bed of straw with a blanket that provides little warmth and the sounds of animals shifting beside you. You open your eyes, greeted by the constant discomfort, a kind of numb acceptance that this is life now. You stretch, careful not to hit your head on the low ceiling beams again. The smoke from last night's fire lingers in the air, thick and pungent, as there is no chimney to draw it out. It mingles with the scent of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the faint smell of animals. The goat that sleeps in your corner stirs, its large eyes blinking in the soft morning light. You don't own a goat, at least, not that you can remember, but this one has made itself comfortable in your hut, seemingly content with the warmth you offer. You roll your eyes but are too tired to care. This is Dark Age Britain, where even a goat is more consistent than the weather. You rise, careful not to disturb your sleeping family, and shuffle over to the door. Your tunic, which smells faintly of goat urine again, is in a crumpled heap by the door. You put it on anyway. What other option do you have? If you don't wear it, you'd be naked. And in Dark Age Britain, being naked in public is a quick way to find yourself accused of witchcraft or worse. Your day begins with a strange mix of resignation and necessity. You step outside into the heavy morning mist, the chill biting into your exposed skin as the sun still struggles to make its way through the clouds. The ground is soft underfoot, the earth soaked by the last night's rain. It's a constant battle with mud, wet clothes, and the unrelenting cold. As you make your way over to the fire pit to cook whatever is left in your pot, the world around you is both eerily silent and disturbingly alive. Creatures scurrying in the mud, the distant clucking of chickens, and the occasional grunt from a pig. Life is grim, but it moves on. Breakfast is a concept more than an event. It is whatever you can scrape together from the remains of last night's gruel. The idea of a proper meal is foreign to you. What you eat is not a matter of luxury or taste, but of survival. You mix some meager leftovers with water, hoping it's enough to fill the hollow ache in your stomach. And you eat carefully, slowly, because there's a sense that this meal might be the last of its kind for a while. The world around you has no place for convenience, comfort, or luxury. Here, you are not just living, you are surviving. Every day is a reminder of the fragility of your existence. No clocks, no calendars. Time is measured by the changing of seasons, by the work to be done, and by the ever-present threat of hunger, disease, or raid. The world is harsh, and the luxury of simplicity in life is a thing of distant memories. This is the reality of Dark Age Britain. It's not a place of thriving. It's a place of surviving. A place where every day is a battle against nature, disease, and the cruel forces that govern life and death. So settle in as we take you deeper into the world of Dark Age Britain and explore why simply surviving here, day after day, would be a challenge too great for most of us. But before we dive into the harshness of Dark Age Britain, let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it in your part of the world? I always love hearing where you're all joining from. And if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy the journey. Of course, the life of a peasant in Dark Age Britain was not just marked by the brutal realities of nature and the struggle for food, but also by an ever-present, invisible enemy, disease. Unlike today, where medical knowledge and sanitary practices offer some protection against the perils of illness, the people of the Dark Ages had no understanding of the microscopic threats that ravaged their bodies. In fact, in their world, the very idea of hygiene was foreign. Bathing, when it happened at all, was a rarity often seen as unnecessary or even dangerous. People lived in close quarters with their livestock, and their homes, made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs, were cramped, damp, and poorly ventilated. As the people went about their daily routines, illness was a constant threat, a silent, invisible force that could strike at any moment, often without warning. For most, the mere act of getting a scrape or a wound would lead to unimaginable consequences. What we today might treat with a simple bandage or a dose of antibiotics was, for them, a potential death sentence. An infected wound could fester, turning into a deadly abscess, or worse, spreading the infection throughout the body. Without knowledge of germs or bacteria, and without any understanding of how diseases spread, the people of Dark Age Britain lived in constant fear of the illnesses that might strike them, especially during the colder months when conditions worsened. The average person didn't need to be struck down by something exotic or rare for their life to end prematurely. They could die from something as simple as a cough or a minor injury. But the greatest and most terrifying of these threats was the plague, an invisible storm that could wipe out entire villages in a matter of days. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, was one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Arriving in Britain in 1348, it struck with the brutal force of a natural disaster, cutting down the population with chilling speed. The symptoms were horrendous: fever, swollen and painful lymph nodes, called buboes, vomiting, and sometimes, if the infection progressed rapidly enough, death within days. The Black Death didn't care who you were, how much money you had, or what you did for a living. It was an equal opportunity killer. Unlike today, when we have vaccines and treatments to combat many of the deadly diseases that once ravaged the world, there was no such help in the Dark Ages. The doctors, who were just as baffled and helpless as the common folk, had no effective treatments. They had their theories. Of course, some believed it was caused by bad air or miasma, while others thought it was divine punishment. But in the end, it was a simple, brutal fact. The plague killed, and it killed indiscriminately. The very air you breathed, the food you ate, the hands you shook, all were potential vectors of the disease. But it wasn't just the Black Death that ravaged Britain. Throughout the Dark Ages, disease was a constant companion to the people. Epidemics of various illnesses swept through villages, and with each passing wave, more lives were claimed. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and cholera were among the many diseases that had devastating effects, each leaving its mark on a society that had no means of fighting them. Even what we today consider mild illnesses, colds, fevers, or common infections, could become deadly in an environment with no medical infrastructure to speak of. What exacerbated this constant threat of death was the unhygienic living conditions in which most people lived. Overcrowded homes, often shared by several families, were the norm, especially in the lower classes. The lack of space and the closeness of both humans and animals made it nearly impossible to contain the spread of disease. People slept side by side, with animals sharing their living spaces, adding to the filth. Goats, chickens, and pigs were kept in the same room as the family, providing warmth in the cold months, but also contributing to the spread of germs. Their waste was not disposed of properly. There were no toilets, no sewage systems, and it would accumulate in corners, around the hearths, and in the straw on the floor. The very walls of these homes were soaked with moisture, creating an ideal breeding ground for bacteria and mold. And then there was the issue of water. Clean, fresh water was hard to come by. Wells could be contaminated with disease, and in many villages, there was no running water, meaning people would have to walk miles just to fetch what little they could. This water was often shared with animals, and without any understanding of the need for clean drinking water, diseases like dysentery spread quickly. Bathing, as we know it today, was considered unnecessary, and people didn't wash their hands before eating or cooking. Hygiene was seen as something frivolous, something the Romans had invented but was soon discarded as a foreign luxury. People's hands would be caked with mud and grime, their clothes stained with filth, and their bodies rarely scrubbed or cleaned. The lack of attention to personal cleanliness contributed to the rapid spread of illnesses, and with no antibiotics to turn to, even a minor infection could quickly become fatal. In the midst of all this, the medieval doctors, who were supposed to be the healers and protectors of the people, were no better off. They, too, were ignorant of the true causes of disease. The most common treatments were herbal remedies and rudimentary surgeries, none of which had the faintest understanding of how bacteria and viruses worked. The most notorious medical tool of the time, the bloodletting leech, was a standard procedure for almost every ailment, whether it was a fever or a festering wound. But the medieval doctors' lack of real knowledge only made matters worse. There were no germ theories, no understanding of hygiene, and no vaccines. The plague, for example, spread with terrifying speed, and the doctors, dressed in their eerie, beak-like masks filled with herbs to ward off the bad air, could only stand helplessly by as entire communities were wiped out. They knew nothing about how the disease spread or how to stop it, and their treatments were nothing more than a combination of superstition and ignorance. As death loomed over every family and every street, the people of Dark Age Britain found themselves at the mercy of their own bodies. They had no power to stop the disease, no protection against the invisible killers that haunted their everyday lives. Every day, the risk of illness was the greatest enemy, and survival was a fleeting hope. The constant threat of death lingered in the background, as ever-present as the wet, cold fog that seemed to hang over the land. In Dark Age Britain, death was not an anomaly, it was the natural order of things. Disease, filth, and the absence of medicine made life fragile, and every corner, every breath, could hold the potential for doom. For many, it wasn't a matter of if they would die, but when. And it was the fear of disease, the lack of understanding, and the desperate scramble for survival that made life in this age not only miserable but precarious beyond imagination. As if the constant threat of disease was not enough to threaten survival, the people of Dark Age Britain also had to contend with the ever-present specter of hunger. The land was harsh and unpredictable, with weather patterns that could shift with little warning. The cyclical nature of farming, which relied heavily on the weather, often turned a bountiful harvest into a distant memory. These fluctuations between feast and famine would define the lives of peasants and villagers for centuries. The harvests were not only unreliable, they were the foundation of life itself. In a world without refrigeration, preservatives, or transportation networks that could supply food from far and wide, the success of the crops meant the difference between life and death. A year of abundant rain could result in lush fields, golden with barley and oats, promising a good winter. But in a single season, the weather could turn too much rain, too little sun, frost at the wrong time, and entire crops could fail. The devastating effects of a failed harvest rippled through the village, leaving the people with nothing but empty stomachs and the grim realization that the coming months would be a battle to survive. A poor harvest often meant that there was little to go around, and food, which most people took for granted, became a luxury. The village might attempt to make do with what little was left, what few grains could be salvaged, what little animals they had left, but the reality was, many families faced the brutal consequences of famine. Fields, once teeming with life, could become barren wastelands, and when the crops failed, it wasn't just the food that ran out, it was the hope of survival itself. Even in times of good harvests, food was never guaranteed to be abundant. The medieval diet was based on what could be grown locally or what could be hunted, both of which were limited. For the peasants of Dark Age Britain, their diet was starkly repetitive and monotonous. A simple bowl of pottage, a thin, watery stew of barley, oats, or sometimes peas was the standard meal, often lacking the flavor or nutrition needed to maintain a healthy body. Though sometimes flavored with a bit of onion, garlic, or cabbage, these additions were rare, making every meal a dull and tiresome repetition of starchy grains. Without refrigeration or preservation methods, meat was a rare luxury. Most villages relied on small livestock such as chickens or goats, which were kept for their milk or eggs. But slaughtering these animals for meat was a last resort, reserved for moments of desperation. Hunting, though a more exciting prospect, was also limited by a variety of factors. Laws restricting hunting, the depletion of wildlife, and the difficulty of catching anything in the wild. Those who lived near rivers or lakes could occasionally fish, but even then, their chances were slim. If a family could catch a fish, it would often be salted to preserve it, or if the fish was too small or scarce, it might be consumed fresh and in very small portions. In the worst of times, even the few animals kept for food might be slaughtered prematurely, leading to further lack of sustenance in the months ahead. The act of hunting and foraging itself became increasingly more dangerous as food scarcity led to an increase in violence over resources. Villagers might risk stealing food from a neighboring farm, or worse, resort to desperate measures like raiding a market or even killing livestock for their meat. A lack of food could break down the very social structures that held villages together, turning communities into tight, defensive clusters and forcing their members to ration and fight for survival. Nutritionally, the people of Dark Age Britain were constantly battling against deficiencies that were deeply ingrained in their way of life. The diet was low in variety, composed mainly of oats, barley, and a meager supply of vegetables. Malnutrition became an endemic issue, leading to diseases and conditions that plagued the population. Rickets, scurvy, and other ailments related to vitamin deficiencies were rampant in communities across Britain. Without fruits and vegetables that were rich in essential vitamins like vitamin C, people often suffered from scurvy, a disease that caused bleeding gums, tooth loss, and extreme fatigue. The condition was a direct result of an inadequate diet, as people lived on what they could grow and afford. Rickets, a disease caused by a deficiency in vitamin D, was also common in Dark Age Britain. People spent their days working in the fields or in poorly lit homes, often trapped by the oppressive weather and a lack of sunshine. Without the ability to soak up vitamin D from sunlight or consume vitamin D-rich foods like fish and fortified dairy products, the bones of many peasants began to weaken. Children, especially, were vulnerable to these afflictions, their bones deformed by the lack of essential nutrients, leaving them physically fragile and vulnerable to injury. For many, the hunger that accompanied malnutrition was not a feeling of emptiness, it was a gnawing physical pain. The body weakened, and as a result, the immune system faltered. Even minor infections could become life-threatening in a body starved of nourishment. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia, a sore could become gangrene, and the struggle to fight off disease became that much harder when the body lacked the energy to defend itself. Food, for those in Dark Age Britain, was far more than just a means of survival. It was a necessity that shaped every aspect of life. A good harvest meant the possibility of surviving another year. But when the crops failed, it meant the entire community would suffer. Children often went without proper nourishment, their bodies stunted, their minds dulled from hunger. The elderly, too, became particularly vulnerable to the effects of malnutrition, and many would perish not just from illness, but from the effects of a weak, undernourished body. In the absence of a reliable food source, the people of Dark Age Britain had no real recourse. There were no supermarkets, no global supply chains, and no quick fixes. Instead, people relied on the land and the weather, and if either failed, they were left to face the harsh realities of their environment. Survival became an endless struggle against the elements and against the scarcity of food. The scarcity, in turn, led to a constant fear of starvation, a fear that permeated every day and shaped the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Despite the odds, the people of Dark Age Britain endured. They learned to adapt to the challenges posed by malnutrition and hunger, finding ways to stretch what little they had and make do with what was available. They grew what they could, hunted what they could, and preserved food when they could. And though they lived with the knowledge that each day was a gamble against the elements, the harvest, and their own bodies, they survived. They survived because survival was all they knew. As if the relentless threat of disease and malnutrition weren't enough to contend with, the people of Dark Age Britain also faced the constant struggle of surviving within their primitive shelters. With no modern infrastructure or building techniques, most homes were nothing more than humble huts, constructed from basic materials that offered little protection against the unforgiving elements. The simple thatched roofs that crowned their homes were a poor defense against the weather. While they provided some shelter from the sun, they were no match for the wind, rain, or snow that lashed at them during the long, harsh seasons. The roofs, made from straw and reeds, were prone to leaks. Over time, the weight of the rain would soak through the thatch, causing water to drip steadily into the interior. On days when it rained, which seemed all too frequent in Dark Age Britain, people often found themselves trying to catch the drips with bowls or cloths, only to find the water seeping through the walls and dampening the earth floors beneath them. The constant presence of dampness created an oppressive, unhealthy atmosphere. The moisture in the air, combined with the ever-present odor of wet wool and straw, a smell that lingered in the corners of every hut, never truly left. The floors of these homes were often little more than compacted earth or rough wooden planks, muddy, uneven, and constantly churned up by the inhabitants and their animals. These floors were breeding grounds for filth and disease. The mixture of human and animal waste, which went largely uncleaned, became part of the texture of daily life. The earth would shift with each step, the ground soft and uneven, making simple tasks like getting dressed or cooking meals an awkward and uncomfortable process. Yet the people had no choice but to live with it. There was no alternative, no higher standard of living to aspire to. This was their reality, and they endured it with a resilience born of necessity. As night descended, the temperature dropped, and the lack of insulation in these homes made them even colder. Without central heating or even proper fireplaces, the inhabitants were left to contend with the bitter chill that permeated their shelters. Firewood was precious, and those fortunate enough to have a hearth in their hut would gather around it in the evenings, huddling together to stay warm. But firewood wasn't always plentiful, especially during harsh winters when the snow buried the landscape and made it difficult to gather wood or other resources. Without a steady fire, the bitter cold could easily seep into the bones of the villagers, leaving them vulnerable to illness, frostbite, or even death. The cold, in particular, was a silent killer. During the worst of the winter months, if a fire went out or a home was left without any source of warmth, the risk of freezing to death was a real threat. Many people succumbed to the cold in their sleep, their bodies stiffening before the dawn could warm the air again. Those who lived alone were especially vulnerable. In the absence of family or community, it wasn't uncommon for people to perish quietly in their huts, unnoticed until someone went looking for them. Even when a fire was kept burning, the cold was always present, lurking just outside the thin walls of their homes. The wind howled through the cracks in the structure, making the walls shudder and whistle in protest. The howling wind seemed relentless, as if it too had a mind to drive them to madness. On those nights, as the cold pressed in from every side, sleep was a fleeting comfort. It was a battle between the warmth of the fire and the cold creeping in from the outside, a struggle that kept many awake throughout the long hours of the night. When it wasn't raining, it was snowing. When it wasn't snowing, the wind was howling with all the fury of a world untouched by mercy. The elements never rested, and neither did the people. They lived in a constant state of tension, never truly warm, always fearful of the changing weather that could sweep into their homes and rob them of the little comfort they had. The earth itself seemed to fight against them, mocking their attempts to carve out a stable existence. In this environment, personal belongings were scarce. There were no luxury items, no items to fill the shelves of their homes to make them feel more comfortable or secure. What they did have, clothing, tools, and necessities, were often of poor quality, barely enough to endure the harsh conditions they faced every day. The clothing was often made of rough wool, which was uncomfortable and difficult to dry when it got wet. People could not afford the luxury of multiple sets of clothing, so when the rain or snow soaked through, they had no choice but to wear them and suffer the discomfort of being cold and wet. The air itself, damp with humidity and moisture, made everything feel soaked through, even when the weather outside seemed calm. The constant battle against the elements made it nearly impossible for people to truly relax or enjoy their surroundings. There was no escape from the cold or dampness that lingered in the air, and no way to truly get away from the discomfort of living in a home that offered little protection. For those who lived in the larger cities, the buildings were no better. They might have been made of stone, but the drafts in the rooms were just as chilling, the heating options just as poor. The streets were narrow and crowded, with no chance for warmth or respite from the wind, leaving people vulnerable at every corner. Despite all these hardships, the people of Dark Age Britain found ways to endure. They adapted to their circumstances, even if it meant living with constant discomfort and hardship. Their homes might have been small, leaky, and cold, but they were also where they built their lives. The bonds of family and community were often stronger than the surrounding walls, providing warmth in a world that was otherwise unyielding and indifferent. They found ways to make their lives meaningful, in spite of the physical challenges they faced. They worked together to keep warm, to share food, to survive the winters and the seasons that would otherwise have claimed them. Yet the lack of proper shelter, the constant struggle to stay warm and dry, was a reminder of how fragile life was in the Dark Ages. Each day was a challenge, each season a gamble. The elements, much like the diseases and lack of food, were forces that could not be controlled, only endured. And for the people of that time, enduring was all they could do. The daily struggles of life in Dark Age Britain were compounded by the constant threat of illness and injury. In a world where survival depended as much on luck as on skill, health was never something people could take for granted. With no knowledge of germs or bacteria, medical care was rudimentary at best and terrifyingly primitive at worst. The remedies of the time were rooted in superstition and ancient practices that, while based on some semblance of logic, offered little in the way of effective treatments. Medical knowledge was, by today's standards, a shadow of what we know now. Doctors, if they could even be called that, lacked the tools or understanding to diagnose or treat disease properly. Illnesses were often attributed to supernatural causes, bad spirits, curses, or the wrath of the gods. In a world that knew nothing of bacteria, viruses, or hygiene, people turned to what they knew: ritual, prayer, and superstition. The most common treatments for illness during this time involved the use of bloodletting, leeches, and various herbal concoctions. Bloodletting was believed to balance the humors of the body and cure a host of ailments, from headaches to fever. Unfortunately, it also had the potential to weaken the patient further, sometimes leading to death from blood loss or infection. Leeches, which were similarly thought to help restore balance, were also widely used. They were placed on the skin to drain what was believed to be bad blood, though their ability to cure anything was highly dubious at best. In many cases, the patient would be left weaker, with no improvement in their condition. Herbal remedies were another staple in the Dark Age healer's arsenal. These included potions and infusions made from plants and roots that had been passed down through generations. While some herbs may have had actual medicinal properties, the lack of proper understanding meant that many people drank concoctions that could do little more than soothe symptoms or provide a placebo effect. For every successful remedy, countless others did little to cure illness and, in some cases, made things worse. And then there were the more extreme measures. Without knowledge of hygiene or the ability to isolate diseases, the mere act of treatment often carried its own risks. Doctors and healers, who were frequently in close contact with the sick, had no concept of contamination or infection. This made it easy for diseases to spread from one person to another, especially in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Treating one person could lead to infecting an entire village if the healer was not careful. Injuries, meanwhile, were an almost daily occurrence in the harsh world of Dark Age Britain. The work of a peasant or villager was physically demanding, and it didn't take much for a tool to slip or for an animal to become aggressive. Farming, a primary occupation, involved the use of sharp tools, sickles, plows, knives, and the risk of injury was high. Even a small cut or nick from a tool could become a dangerous infection. Without the benefit of antibiotics or any real understanding of sanitation, these simple injuries could easily spiral out of control. Animal attacks were another common hazard. With domestic animals roaming free and wild creatures still present in the forests, the people of Dark Age Britain were often vulnerable to bites or scratches from animals. Even a relatively minor bite could turn deadly, as infections would spread quickly, and without proper medical care, the body was left to fight the infection on its own, often unsuccessfully. Rabies, a disease that could be contracted through animal bites, was just one of the dangers faced by those who lived close to nature. In addition to bites and scratches, many people sustained injuries during the numerous raids and skirmishes that marked the period. The threat of Viking invasions was a very real concern, and villages were often attacked and pillaged. In these situations, people were exposed not only to the trauma of being attacked, but also to the risk of infection from wounds inflicted during battle. Injuries sustained in battle were often left untreated, as the concept of battlefield medicine was not yet a reality. Wounds would be cleaned with whatever was available, but without proper antiseptics, gangrene often set in. With no organized medical system, people had to rely on whatever healing knowledge was passed down to them. Healers, who were often women in the community, might attempt to treat broken bones by binding them together with cloth, but the results were usually less than satisfactory. The lack of proper tools and medical facilities meant that the best one could hope for was a form of healing that was more about survival than true recovery. Most villagers did not live long enough to need advanced medical care. Life expectancy in Dark Age Britain was low, and for those who survived childhood, it was often a life marked by physical hardship, disease, and frequent injury. Even the healthiest people would have to contend with periods of illness and injury, and without proper treatment, these conditions could quickly turn life-threatening. The more fortunate would survive, but the unlucky few would succumb to infections or illnesses that could have been easily treated had the knowledge and resources been available. For those who did manage to survive injuries and diseases, the scars, both physical and psychological, were often permanent. Deformities from untreated infections, missing limbs from accidents, and constant pain from old injuries were just part of life. The harshness of daily life in Dark Age Britain, combined with the lack of medical knowledge, made survival a constant struggle. The lack of proper medical care in Dark Age Britain was not just a tragedy for the people who lived through it, but it also shaped the very fabric of society. A community where disease, injury, and death were constant threats would naturally develop its own ways of coping. Superstitions and rituals emerged to try to ward off the unknown, but there was no true understanding of the underlying causes of illness or injury. This ignorance led to a cycle of suffering, where people were often left to endure in silence, trusting in remedies and practices that offered little more than false hope. Ultimately, the lack of medical care in Dark Age Britain meant that illness and injury were a daily fear for everyone. People lived in a world where survival was uncertain, where even the smallest cut could lead to death, and where disease spread unchecked. The medical practices of the time, though rooted in the best knowledge available, were tragically ineffective and dangerous. For those living in this time, the best hope for survival was not found in the hands of a healer or doctor, but in the ability to endure, to survive against the odds, and to make it through another day in a world that offered little in the way of safety or comfort. As if the daily struggles of survival weren't enough, life in Dark Age Britain was further complicated by the constant threat of violence from outside forces. While disease and famine made life precarious, the ever-present risk of a raid or battle cast a long shadow over every village and settlement. In this turbulent time, the threat of Viking invasions was a specter that haunted the lives of the people, a menace that could descend without warning and leave devastation in its wake. These raids were not isolated incidents. They were part of a brutal, ongoing campaign that reshaped the landscape of Britain. The Vikings, fierce warriors from Scandinavia, were a constant threat to the villages of Britain. For the inhabitants of Dark Age Britain, the sound of distant longships on the horizon was enough to send terror through their hearts. These seafaring raiders were known for their speed, skill, and unpredictability. They could appear from the sea without warning, their ships cutting through the waters like a shadow in the night, and with them came violence and destruction. When a Viking raid occurred, it was rarely a battle in the traditional sense. It was a brutal attack, aimed not just at conquest, but at plunder and terror. The Vikings were skilled in both land and sea warfare, and they were known to strike quickly and decisively. Whole villages could be wiped out in a matter of hours. The invaders would storm the village, burning homes, looting valuables, and taking prisoners. No one was safe. Men, women, and children alike were subjected to the violence. Those who resisted were often killed on the spot, their lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The raids were marked by brutal acts of violence, burnings, beheadings, and massacres. It was a nightmare that could unfold at any time, and the people had little recourse for defense. The Vikings did not just leave death in their wake, they also left fear. Fear that at any moment the next raid could be coming. Fear that your village, your home, your family would be destroyed. The brutality of the Viking invasions made it clear that survival in Dark Age Britain was a constant gamble. Even if you managed to escape the initial wave of destruction, there was no guarantee that your village would be spared. For many, the raids became a cruel cycle of rebuilding, only for it to be undone once again by the next Viking attack. But the threat of violence didn't end with the Viking raids. Even if your village was lucky enough to escape the fury of the Viking warriors, there were still the constant skirmishes and battles between rival clans and tribes to contend with. In a land where loyalty to a local lord or chieftain was paramount, disputes over land, power, and resources often led to conflict. These skirmishes could range from small-scale raids, where one village would pillage another for livestock or supplies, to full-fledged battles between rival clans. The rules of warfare were simple. Survival was the goal, and everything else was secondary. Without the modern concepts of national defense or standing armies, protection in Dark Age Britain was reliant on local forces. A village's survival depended not on the strength of a central government, but on the strength of its local lords, warriors, and defenders. These leaders were responsible for organizing the defense of their people. If the village was fortunate, it had a strong lord who could offer some protection, organizing a militia to fend off invaders and rivals. But even then, protection was never guaranteed. The lack of formal defense systems meant that every village was vulnerable, and every person was exposed to the threat of war. No walls, no fortifications, no armies were available to provide true safety. You relied on the strength of your own people and on your ability to fight for your survival. In the event of a raid or skirmish, your only hope was that your village had enough capable warriors to defend it, or that your lord had the resources to send reinforcements. But these resources were often scarce. The constant warfare, both with Viking invaders and rival clans, drained the land of its wealth, leaving the villagers in a perpetual state of uncertainty and fear. The violence of war was something that every person in Dark Age Britain had to face, and it left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the people. Even those who survived the initial attacks still faced the lingering effects of war. If you were fortunate enough to live through a Viking raid or a battle, the aftermath was rarely a return to peace. The land was scarred by the violence, villages lay in ruins, and families were left mourning the loss of loved ones. And then, as if to mock the survivors, the cycle of violence would begin again. For the people of Dark Age Britain, war was a constant and unrelenting force, one that could turn their world upside down at any moment. In these times, the idea of safety was an illusion. No matter how strong your home or how much food you had stored, it could all be taken from you in the blink of an eye. The concept of a peaceful life was reserved for those in power, those who could afford to live behind high walls and armies. For the common folk of Britain, survival was a day-to-day struggle, and the threat of raids and warfare was an ever-present fear. The reality of Dark Age Britain was that no one was ever truly safe, and even those who managed to survive the ravages of disease, famine, and war could be undone by a single Viking raid or a dispute between clans. It was this constant state of fear that defined life in Dark Age Britain. Survival was not guaranteed, and it was often a matter of chance. The Vikings, the rival clans, the lack of proper protection, these were the harsh realities of living in a time when life was short, brutal, and unpredictable. Even if you managed to escape the clutches of one threat, you were always vulnerable to another. The people of Dark Age Britain lived in a world where war and violence were constant companions, and where survival was never assured. Every day was a fight to hold on to life, and for many, the fight didn't last long. In Dark Age Britain, where survival was an unending struggle against nature and violence, the social system itself added another layer of hardship. For the vast majority of people, life was dictated not by their own choices or ambitions, but by the whims of landowners, lords, and kings. The feudal system, which defined much of medieval Europe, was a complex hierarchy that trapped peasants at the bottom, their lives bound to the land they worked, and the lords who controlled it. And within this system, the risk of exploitation and suffering was a constant reality, as most people were born into servitude with little hope of escape. The hard life of peasants in Dark Age Britain was marked by toil, poverty, and near-perpetual labor. For these people, land was not something they could own or cultivate for their own benefit. Instead, it was a means of survival. If you worked the land, you could feed yourself and your family. But it was always at the mercy of someone else's decision. The vast majority of peasants lived on land owned by a lord or a noble, and their entire existence revolved around meeting the demands of these landowners. Unlike today, where ownership of property or land is seen as a symbol of status and success, in Dark Age Britain, it was a luxury that few would ever know. As a peasant, you didn't have the right to live off the land as you saw fit. You didn't get to decide what crops were grown or how the land was managed. That responsibility fell squarely on the shoulders of the Lord, and what the Lord wanted, the peasants had to deliver. Whether it was planting the right crops, tending to the livestock, or laboring in the fields from dawn until dusk, the work was grueling, and the rewards were few. Most peasants never saw anything resembling wealth. Their pay was simply the privilege of staying alive another day to work the land again. It was a cycle of hard labor that left little room for rest, let alone personal ambition or growth. The daily grind for a peasant was not just about working the land. It was about the constant fear of losing what little you had. If a landowner was dissatisfied, or if the harvest didn't meet expectations, you were the one who bore the consequences. A poor harvest meant fewer resources for everyone, and in a feudal system, the burden was always placed on the peasants to bear the brunt of that loss. Without any real say in how things were run, a peasant's survival depended on the whims of their lord. If the lord had a good harvest, the peasants might have enough food to see them through the year. If not, it meant suffering through a harsh winter or, worse, starvation. The exploitation of the peasantry was rampant in the feudal system. If you were born into servitude, your entire life would be spent working for someone else's wealth. The idea of upward mobility, being able to work hard and earn enough to improve your station, was a distant fantasy for most. The closest most peasants came to upward movement was the possibility of gaining a little more land to work. But even then, the land still belonged to someone else. Peasants worked under constant pressure to meet their lord's demands, and failure to do so often led to harsh punishment, whether through physical labor, fines, or even imprisonment. In some cases, when a lord's greed outweighed his need for labor, he could take from the peasants whatever he wanted, including their food, their livestock, or even their lives. What made this life even more oppressive was the fact that the peasants had no control over their own work. Work was not simply a means to an end, it was a relentless, all-consuming force that dictated every waking moment. From planting to harvest, every day was a struggle for survival. There was little room for leisure or relaxation, and the work was often backbreaking. Whether it was tilling the land by hand, carrying heavy loads of grain, or tending to the animals, the physical toll on a peasant's body was immense. Many peasants died young due to the physical strain or injuries sustained from farming tools, all while knowing that they would leave behind little more than a humble grave and a legacy of labor. Peasants didn't have the luxury of choosing their profession or making decisions about their future. They lived and worked for their lord's profit. Even the smallest error could have disastrous consequences, and the weight of such an existence was a heavy burden on their families. The few possessions that peasants had, often only a tunic and a few tools, were tied directly to their ability to work. If they were injured or fell ill, they faced even greater hardships. Work continued, whether they were well or sick, and any failure to meet the demands of their lord could result in severe punishment. There was little to no support in Dark Age Britain for someone caught in the feudal system. There were no schools, no guilds, no unions, no help from a modern government. If you were born into poverty, you would likely stay in that position your entire life, trapped by the land and by the demands of the lords. There were no rights to protect you, no laws to keep your lord from taking everything you had. If you complained, you were punished. If you protested, you were silenced. The life of a peasant in Dark Age Britain was one of silence, hard work, and fear, with little opportunity to change anything for the better. Over time, the feudal system cemented this cycle of exploitation. It kept the power with the few and left the majority of the population in servitude, unable to break free from their circumstances. Even though the land was worked by peasants, it was the lords who owned everything: the crops, the animals, and the very soil they toiled over. In exchange for their labor, peasants received little more than the right to live on the land and a roof over their heads. But even that was tenuous. Peasants had to rely on their own wits and the occasional kindness of others to survive. The hardest thing about their existence was not the labor itself, but the unrelenting hopelessness. In the Dark Ages, there were no dreams of prosperity or upward mobility, just survival. The cycle of overwork, exploitation, and despair continued until the day a peasant died, often from exhaustion or an illness that could have been easily treated in another time. But in Dark Age Britain, even the smallest injury or illness could mean death. If a peasant was lucky enough to grow old, they would pass their life's work to their children, who would follow in their footsteps. The few who were able to gain some level of autonomy through a hard-fought struggle were considered lucky. But for the majority, survival meant following orders and living in constant fear of the inevitable day when the Lord would ask for more than they could give. And in Dark Age Britain, there was little hope of escaping the feudal system once you were trapped in it. This was the fate of most people in Dark Age Britain, born into servitude, living to serve, and dying with no legacy other than the labor they had provided for the few who controlled the land. The feudal system was designed to keep the vast majority of the population in place, forever tethered to the land and to the whims of the landowner. In this world, survival was not a matter of choice, it was simply a matter of enduring. Life in Dark Age Britain was cruel, brief, and uncertain. It was a time when survival was anything but guaranteed, and the specter of death hovered over every person, every family, every community, with constant threats from disease, malnutrition, accidents, and violence. The average life expectancy for people living under the feudal system was painfully short. Most people did not live to see their 40 seconds, and many children never survived long enough to enjoy their first taste of adulthood. The hardships of the time were unforgiving, and the high mortality rate was just one of the many grim realities of feudal life. For those born into the feudal system, childhood was an especially perilous time. While the birth of a child was often a cause for celebration, it was equally a reminder of how fragile life was. The harsh conditions of Dark Age Britain meant that most children faced significant risks from the moment they were born. Disease was rampant, and with little to no knowledge of hygiene or medical care, simple illnesses that would seem trivial today could turn fatal. If a child survived the first year of life, they had already overcome what many would consider the hardest obstacle. But even then, survival remained uncertain, and the odds of making it through childhood were slim. Infant mortality was alarmingly high during this period, and it was a cruel fact of life for nearly every family. The statistics of the time are staggering. More than half of children born to peasant families did not survive their first 5 years. There were a multitude of factors contributing to this high infant mortality rate. Disease, malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lack of proper medical care all combined to ensure that only the lucky few survived the perilous first years of life. The risk of contracting deadly infections, from the most minor cuts to the common cold, was ever present. In a world where food was scarce and quality nutrition was a luxury, malnutrition was another deadly factor that took a heavy toll on children. The lack of essential vitamins and nutrients could lead to debilitating conditions like rickets, scurvy, and other illnesses that weaken young bodies. Malnutrition stunted growth, weakened the immune system, and made even the simplest infections harder to fight off. A poor diet of little more than oats, barley, and the occasional piece of meat or fish could not sustain the human body in the way that it needed. Young children, whose bodies were still growing, were especially vulnerable to the lack of proper nutrition. In a time when famine and poor harvests were common, the survival of children was often a game of chance. If the harvest failed or the weather turned sour, the food supply became even more unreliable. Families with limited resources were forced to make do with whatever they could find, but the lack of variety in the diet meant that even those who survived the initial hardships were at risk of developing health problems. The scarce resources, when combined with the constant threat of disease and the harsh realities of living in a medieval society, made the early years of life a perilous journey for many children. Even those who made it past childhood often had little chance of seeing old age. The average life expectancy in Dark Age Britain was shockingly short. In the 5th to 10th centuries, a person might expect to live only into their 30 seconds or early 40 seconds, if they were fortunate enough to survive the numerous threats that life threw their way. With no modern medical treatments or understanding of disease, simple infections could become deadly, and accidents, whether from farming, animal attacks, or even warfare, often resulted in death. People lived in a state of constant danger, knowing that their next step might be their last. If you survived your childhood, you still had to contend with the many other perils life threw at you. While those who lived into adulthood might find themselves physically stronger, the risks they faced never truly abated. The lack of medical care meant that even minor injuries could lead to severe complications, and accidents were a part of everyday life. In a world where most people worked with dangerous farming tools, livestock, or even in battle, injuries were a common occurrence. A cut, a broken bone, or a wound from an animal attack could quickly become infected. In the absence of proper antiseptics, antibiotics, and even simple hygiene, these small injuries often became life-threatening. Even those who managed to avoid disease and injury were not safe from the ravages of time and the harshness of their environment. The relentless toil of working the land, tending to animals, and building rudimentary shelters left the average person physically worn down long before their time. Overwork was another silent killer, as the demands of the feudal system meant that people were often forced to work from dawn until dusk, with little rest and fewer comforts. For many, their bodies simply wore out from the grueling labor required to sustain their families and fulfill their obligations to their lord. Without the benefit of modern medicine, people had few options when it came to dealing with sickness. Most remedies were based on superstition and old wives' tales, and if you were unlucky enough to fall ill, your survival depended largely on luck and the vague belief in divine intervention. The lack of any real medical knowledge meant that even common ailments could result in death. Infections from cuts, diseases like the plague, and even childbirth were all dangerous, and many did not survive them. Even if you were fortunate enough to avoid the major diseases and injuries of the time, the harsh living conditions took their toll on your body. The damp, cold, and filthy environment was a breeding ground for bacteria and illness. The smell of unwashed bodies and animals filled the air, and without the luxury of a proper sewage system or clean water, disease spread easily. People were often forced to live in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, which made it nearly impossible to avoid becoming ill. Despite the many dangers of life in Dark Age Britain, people did not have the luxury of a long lifespan. Death was always just a step away, and survival was not a guarantee. Those who lived to see their 40 seconds were considered lucky, and for the majority of the population, a long life was an unattainable dream. The cycle of birth, disease, and death was a harsh reality, and most people simply endured it, knowing that survival was a fleeting achievement. In a world where the threat of death was constant, the best you could hope for was simply making it to another day. But for many, even that small victory was beyond their reach. In Dark Age Britain, life was a constant struggle against the elements and forces of nature, and one of the most persistent threats came from the wild animals that roamed the land. The dangers posed by these creatures were ever present, and not just a part of the folklore, but an everyday reality for people living during this tumultuous period. From predatory beasts stalking through the woods to the everyday hazards of working alongside domesticated animals, the constant tension between human life and the animal world defined survival in a way that few could escape. It wasn't just about surviving the harsh environment. It was also about surviving the creatures that inhabited it. Wolves were perhaps the most feared of all the wild animals. These creatures, fierce and cunning, were a constant threat, particularly in the colder, more remote areas of Britain. They traveled in packs and were capable of killing livestock, and in some cases, even attacking humans. At night, when the winds howled and darkness blanketed the land, you could hear the distant howls of wolves, sending chills down the spine. These howls weren't just a warning from the wild. They were a reminder that humans were no longer the dominant predators in the world. The wolves knew how to navigate the forest with frightening precision, and they hunted together, making them a formidable threat to any living creature. The packs would often raid small villages, especially those situated on the outskirts of settlements or isolated in the woods. It wasn't uncommon for wolves to invade a farmyard, scavenging whatever they could find. They might tear into pens, killing sheep or even cattle. In some cases, If the wolves were desperate enough or hungry enough, they would venture into the very heart of a village where people were asleep. Imagine waking in the middle of the night to the savage sound of a wolf's growl right outside your hut. The terror that would grip you as you realized that these wild beasts, driven by hunger, might tear through the thatch and come for you. Even the strongest wooden doors or the simplest of stone walls provided little defense against the jaws of a wolf. They were creatures of the night, and their presence was a constant reminder of how tenuous human existence was in the Dark Ages. People would go to great lengths to protect their homes, their livestock, and themselves, setting traps, keeping dogs as guards, and making loud noises to drive the wolves away. But no matter how hard they tried, the wolves always had the advantage of being faster, stealthier, and more ruthless when it came to finding food. But wolves weren't the only creatures that posed a threat. Bears, too, roamed the forests of Britain, although their numbers were smaller. Bears were not only feared for their size and strength, but also for their unpredictable nature. Unlike wolves, bears didn't hunt in packs, but a bear encounter was still a terrifying ordeal. These creatures were capable of causing immense damage to both humans and livestock. A bear might be attracted to a village by the scent of food or a weak animal, and once there, it could attack without warning. Bears, like wolves, were a danger to those who lived near the woods or on the fringes of the more populated areas. When bears were hungry, they were aggressive, and it wasn't uncommon for people to be mauled or killed by them. A single bear could devastate a farm, killing livestock in its path. It was said that those who lived in areas prone to bear sightings often carried weapons or tools to defend themselves. Yet, even with weapons, there was no guarantee of survival if one crossed paths with a bear, especially if it was in a predatory or defensive stance. Besides the larger predators, the life of a medieval farmer was made all the more dangerous by the animals that were domesticated for work, food, or transport. Horses, cattle, and even sheep, while essential to farming life, posed their own set of risks. Horses, strong, were crucial for transportation and plowing fields. Yet, they could be unpredictable. A frightened horse, startled by a loud noise or sudden movement, could easily trample someone. These animals, while valuable, required careful handling and an understanding of their behavior to avoid injury. Cattle, similarly, were indispensable to the economy of Dark Age Britain. They provided milk, leather, and meat, and were used to plow fields or transport goods. But they were large, strong animals, and getting too close to a bull or an agitated cow could result in severe injury. A kick from a cow could break bones, and if one were unlucky enough to be pinned between an angry animal and a fence or gate, it could be fatal. But the real risk wasn't just in the large animals. Even smaller creatures like sheep had their dangers. While not typically dangerous in the traditional sense, sheep were often herded in large groups, and a panicked flock could easily trample a person in their path. In narrow, confined spaces, it wasn't unheard of for an animal to strike out in fear or confusion, causing harm. Farming life in the Dark Ages required constant vigilance. While you worked the fields, you had to be ever watchful of the animals you were handling. There were no easy ways to control these creatures, no safeguards in place, and no modern equipment to ensure safety. Every time you entered the field or barn, you were putting your life at risk. If you weren't careful, you could be trampled, gored, or crushed by an animal in a matter of seconds. Even more dangerous were the wild animals that might attack a family's livestock. Farmers relied heavily on their animals, and a single wolf or bear attack could decimate a family's livelihood. But the animals didn't just pose a threat to livelihood, they posed a threat to life itself. When you woke each morning, knowing that your survival depended on the safety of your animals, you were constantly on edge, aware that the slightest misstep could result in the loss of everything you had worked for, or worse, your life. The risk of wild animals also extended beyond the farm. Traveling through the woods, walking to the market, or even moving between villages put people at risk of encountering wolves, bears, or other dangerous creatures. In the winter months, when food was scarce for both people and animals, predators like wolves became even more dangerous. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to be attacked or for farmers to lose their herds to wolves that had been driven by hunger. In the Dark Ages, life was always uncertain, and the dangers from wild beasts were just one more threat to contend with. People lived in a world where nature was both a provider and a predator, where the line between survival and death was razor thin. Whether it was the terrifying howls of wolves in the distance, the sudden appearance of a bear in your path, or the crushing force of a cow's hoof, the threat of dangerous animals was a constant reminder. Human beings were just another part of the food chain. It wasn't just a matter of living in the land of the wild, it was about surviving it, every day, every hour, every moment. As the dark clouds of medieval Britain hung low over the land, a palpable sense of unease clung to the air. The lives of the people were consumed not just by the physical struggles of survival against famine, disease, and dangerous beasts, but by a profound and constant fear of the unseen. The very fabric of daily life was woven with superstition, and the supernatural held sway over the minds of the people. Life in Dark Age Britain was harsh, unpredictable, and often cruel, and when things went wrong, when crops failed, when sickness spread, when death came too soon, the blame often fell not on the earth or the harsh conditions, but on something far darker: witchcraft, evil spirits, and unseen forces that threatened from beyond the veil of the known world. In a time when medical knowledge was primitive and disease had no known cause, people struggled to make sense of the things that went wrong in their lives. Every unexplainable event, every twist of fate, seemed to be a sign that something dark was at work, something that could not be seen, but was always there. The very concept of witchcraft was not just the idea of casting spells or brewing potions, it was a symbol of the unknown, the unseen forces that could be as deadly as any sword or plague. It was the embodiment of everything people feared, but could not understand. The deep fear of witchcraft was rooted in the widespread belief that the natural world was governed by both benevolent and malevolent forces. Witches, in particular, were seen as those who had crossed the line between the human and the supernatural, wielding dark powers that could harm, curse, or even kill. The concept of witchcraft was not isolated to distant lands or exotic stories. It was a part of daily life in medieval Britain, permeating the thoughts and actions of every community. If something went wrong, if a person fell ill, if livestock died, or if a crop failed, the immediate assumption was that dark forces were at play. It was easier to believe in witches and curses than to acknowledge the randomness of nature and the fickleness of fate. Accusations of witchcraft were often driven by fear rather than reason. The unknown was a frightening thing, and people were quick to point fingers at those who seemed different, those who did not fit into the mold of normal society. If you were an outsider, someone who lived on the margins, perhaps an elderly woman who lived alone, a healer who used strange remedies, or someone who had been known to speak in odd ways, chances were you would be watched carefully. In a world where survival itself was so fragile, the tiniest aberration could be interpreted as a sign of something wrong, something dangerous. A sudden illness, an unexplained death, or a misfortune of any kind was often blamed on the work of witches. It was the perfect scapegoat for a society drowning in fear. The fear of witches was also tied to the deeply ingrained religious beliefs of the time. The Church, with its strict doctrines and dogma, condemned witchcraft as heresy, an act of defiance against God. Witches, it was believed, had made pacts with the devil, forsaking their faith for the promise of dark power. The very idea of witchcraft was seen as a direct affront to the divine order, and as such, those who were suspected of practicing it were seen as enemies of God. Fear of witches and sorcery was not just a fear of the supernatural, but of moral corruption, of the breakdown of the very fabric that held society together. In this context, the hunt for witches became more than a simple search for guilty individuals. It became a righteous crusade, driven by the belief that rooting out the witches would cleanse society and protect it from the forces of evil. The accusations of witchcraft were, in many ways, a tool of control. In a world where the power of the church and the local lords held immense sway, accusations of witchcraft allowed those in power to maintain control over the population. Witches were often seen as dangerous subversives, individuals who threatened the established order. The belief in witches and sorcery justified punishing those who were seen as undesirable, and a convenient means for removing threats to the status quo. It was easier to accuse someone of witchcraft than to address the real issues that plagued society: such as poverty, inequality, or injustice. Accusations of witchcraft were often based on little more than superstition or personal grudges. In many cases, the evidence was flimsy at best. A person could be accused of being a witch simply because they were unfortunate, misunderstood, or different in some way. The act of witchcraft itself was seen as a secretive and sinister one, and the very nature of the accusations made it impossible to disprove them. If someone was accused of casting a spell or causing harm, there was little way to defend oneself. The act of denial was seen as further evidence of guilt. In fact, many who were accused of witchcraft were subjected to brutal torture in an effort to extract a confession. The idea was simple: confess and save yourself from execution. Many women, particularly those who were vulnerable or marginalized, were subjected to unimaginable cruelty under the threat of death, and often those who were accused were the ones who had the least power to fight back. Once someone was accused of witchcraft, their fate was often sealed. Trials for witches were marked by ignorance and superstition, and the penalties were harsh. It was not uncommon for those accused of witchcraft to be sentenced to death, often by burning at the stake or hanging. These executions were public spectacles, meant to serve as a warning to others. The spectacle of a witch's execution was not just about punishing an individual, it was about reinforcing the collective fear of witchcraft and the belief that the community was under constant threat from the supernatural. The execution of a witch was an act of both justice and terror, meant to protect society from the imagined forces of evil. The fear of witchcraft and the accusations that arose from it were not confined to any one region or class. Witches were blamed for the misfortunes of all people, from peasants to lords. In a time of social unrest and instability, fear of the supernatural offered a way to explain the inexplicable and find someone to blame. The accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire, and the panic it created was contagious. People's imaginations were inflamed by stories of witches and demons, and their fears became so overwhelming that they could not distinguish between reality and superstition. In the end, the fear of witchcraft in Dark Age Britain reflected more than just a belief in the supernatural. It reflected a society that was struggling to understand its own powerlessness in the face of disease, war, and social upheaval. The fear of witches, much like the fear of disease or wild beasts, was a manifestation of the terror that ran deep in the hearts of people who had no control over their fate. The hunt for witches, the executions, and the brutal treatment of those accused were all part of the broader pattern of suffering, fear, and helplessness that defined life in the Dark Ages. As time went on, the witch hunt slowly faded, but the legacy of that fear remained. The idea of witches, of evil forces lurking in the shadows, continued to haunt the imagination of people for centuries to come. And for those who lived in the Dark Ages, the true horror was not just the belief in witches, but the very real and deadly consequences that belief could bring. Fear was the true monster in the Dark Ages, and it was a monster that no one could escape. In the harsh, mud-slicked world of Dark Age Britain, where every day was a struggle for survival, knowledge was a rare and elusive treasure. For the vast majority of the population, education was a luxury they could not afford, and literacy was something reserved for the wealthy, the clergy, and the nobility. The common people, the peasants who toiled the land and lived in constant fear of disease, starvation, and war, had little access to the knowledge that could have helped them understand the world beyond their narrow existence. In a time when survival was the primary concern, there was little room for the pursuit of education or the understanding of distant lands, philosophies, or scientific principles. To be without education was not just a disadvantage, it was the norm. Most people in Dark Age Britain could neither read nor write. This was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. The vast majority of the population worked the land, spent their days in the fields or tending livestock, and their nights huddled together in cold, dark huts, trying to stay warm. There was simply no time for reading books or learning abstract concepts. Life was consumed by the basics of survival: gathering food, securing shelter, and fending off the constant threats of nature and human violence. For peasants, education was not seen as a means to improve one's life, but as a distant, unattainable ideal. The wealthy and the clergy, those who controlled the flow of information, had the privilege of reading and learning, while the vast majority of the population remained illiterate, their knowledge confined to the small and immediate world they inhabited. Without the ability to read, knowledge was limited to what could be learned through direct experience. The world beyond one's own village or town was a mystery, and the events that occurred far from home were often understood through the lens of rumor and superstition. The idea of a wider world, a world that stretched beyond the horizon, was almost entirely foreign to the average person in Dark Age Britain. There were no newspapers, no books or libraries, and no formal education systems to expand one's understanding of the world. If something occurred in a distant land, such as a battle, a foreign king's decree, or a change in the weather, it would reach the people of Britain only through the stories of travelers, merchants, or priests, often distorted or exaggerated by the time it reached their ears. This lack of literacy left people vulnerable to superstition and misinformation. Without access to books, written records, or scientific discoveries, people relied heavily on oral traditions, hearsay, and the authority of local leaders, such as priests, healers, or village elders. If something went wrong, if a disease spread through the village, if the crops failed, or if an inexplicable misfortune occurred, people would search for an explanation that made sense to them. And often, that explanation would not come from reason or science, but from the supernatural. Witches, evil spirits, and omens were seen as the cause of illness and misfortune, simply because people had no other way to understand the causes of disease or bad weather. The lack of education meant that people could not distinguish between fact and fiction, and their fears were often driven by the unknown. The absence of written records also meant that history was not something to be learned from books, but something to be told through stories passed down by word of mouth. History, in this sense, was a fluid concept. The past was reshaped by the needs of the present, and facts were often lost or distorted over time. The stories of battles, kings, and saints were recounted, but they were often exaggerated or modified to suit the morals or values of the time. People could not read the true history of their ancestors or understand the complex events that had shaped their world. They only knew what they had been told, which, more often than not, was shaped by those who held power. In this way, the absence of education kept people in a state of ignorance, vulnerable to manipulation by those who controlled the flow of information. In addition to the lack of knowledge about the world, there was also a profound lack of understanding of the natural world. People had little to no scientific knowledge about how the earth functioned, how diseases spread, or how crops grew. Medical knowledge was based on superstition and trial and error. Healers used herbs and potions that had been passed down through generations, but without any real understanding of their efficacy. Many treatments were based on folk beliefs and rituals, rather than scientific principles. The concept of germs, viruses, and bacteria was entirely foreign. If someone fell ill, it was often believed to be the result of divine punishment, evil spirits, or the curse of a witch. This ignorance, while not intentional, led to widespread suffering, as people had no way to understand or combat the diseases that ravaged them. The lack of education also meant that most people could not escape the rigid social structures that defined their lives. The feudal system, which governed Dark Age Britain, was based on the idea of social hierarchy. The nobility, the clergy, and the landowners had access to education, wealth, and power, while peasants had little more than their labor to offer. Without education, peasants had no means of rising above their station in life. Their world was confined to the land they worked, and their survival depended on the whims of their lords. The lack of education kept them in a state of subjugation, as they had no way of questioning or challenging the system that kept them oppressed. The absence of knowledge also left people vulnerable to exploitation. Without the ability to read or write, they could not engage in contracts or understand legal documents. They were at the mercy of the landowners and lords, who could dictate the terms of their labor and the distribution of food. Without education, peasants had no way of organizing or advocating for their rights. The lack of knowledge about the world beyond their village meant that they had no sense of solidarity with others who were suffering in the same way. They were isolated, uneducated, and left to fend for themselves in a world that offered no guarantee of justice or fairness. The lack of education in Dark Age Britain also meant that creativity and innovation were stifled. The majority of people did not have the opportunity to learn new ideas, develop new technologies, or explore new ways of thinking. The world of the Dark Ages was static, with little room for progress. Ideas were passed down through generations. But without the ability to read or write, those ideas could not be recorded or shared with others. The absence of written records meant that much of the knowledge of previous generations was lost or forgotten. There was no way to build on the discoveries of the past, and the world remained unchanged for centuries. In conclusion, the absence of education and knowledge in Dark Age Britain was not just a matter of lacking formal schooling. It was a profound and all-encompassing limitation that shaped the lives of the people in every way. Without literacy, the people of Britain were trapped in a world of superstition, fear, and ignorance. Their understanding of the world was limited to what they experienced firsthand, and they were at the mercy of those who controlled information. The absence of education not only kept people in a state of ignorance, but also reinforced the power structures that kept them oppressed. Without the ability to read, write, or understand the world around them, people had little hope of escaping the brutal reality of their lives. The Dark Ages were defined not just by their hardship, but by the ignorance that pervaded every aspect of life. As the years passed in Dark Age Britain, the daily struggle for survival became ever more complicated by a lack of basic sanitation and hygiene. Life, as harsh and grim as it was, became infinitely more perilous because of the squalid conditions under which the people lived. With no concept of germs, no plumbing, and no effective means of waste management, the citizens of Britain in the Dark Ages faced a relentless battle, not only against the forces of nature and disease, but also against their own environment. This perpetuated illness in ways that were beyond their understanding. Without modern plumbing, the people of Dark Age Britain had to rely on the most basic and rudimentary means to access water, which was, by today's standards, heavily contaminated. Rivers, streams, and wells were often the only sources of drinking water, but these bodies of water were frequently stagnant and tainted. The absence of filtration systems meant that these water sources were a breeding ground for bacteria and other harmful microorganisms. It wasn't uncommon for people to drink from the same rivers that they bathed in, washed their clothes in, and used for other daily tasks, unknowingly subjecting themselves to the risk of disease with every sip. The lack of understanding about the connection between water quality and health meant that people, without hesitation, drank from sources that could easily be tainted with waste, dead animals, or even human excrement. Outbreaks of disease were frequent and widespread, with waterborne illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever being common killers. The people of the Dark Ages had no concept of sanitation or the dangers of contamination, and as a result, diseases spread rapidly through entire communities. When one person fell ill, it was often not long before others began showing symptoms as well. With no way to purify water, the cycle of illness was perpetuated, and survival became an ever more precarious game of chance. Those who could afford it would sometimes boil water to kill harmful organisms, but for the majority, this was a luxury far beyond their reach. In addition to the poor water quality, the absence of any form of toilets created another significant health risk. The lack of public sanitation infrastructure meant that human waste was left to accumulate in open pits, ditches, or simply scattered around settlements. People had no concept of the importance of removing waste from living areas or keeping it out of their water sources. It wasn't unusual for human excrement to be left in the streets, creating a toxic, fetid environment that encouraged the spread of disease. The concept of a sewage system was virtually non-existent, and without any means to properly dispose of waste, the threat of contamination was ever present. The most common form of waste disposal involved digging a small pit behind one's dwelling, or throwing waste into nearby rivers or communal areas. However, with so many people using the same water sources for drinking, bathing, and washing, it became all too easy for waste to enter the water cycle, further exacerbating the spread of disease. The streets of the villages and towns were often filthy, with waste and refuse piling up in open spaces, attracting pests such as rats and flies, which were themselves carriers of disease. Rodents, particularly, were drawn to the filth, and the flea-ridden rats that infested the villages played a pivotal role in the transmission of deadly diseases like the bubonic plague. Lacking knowledge of the importance of hygiene, people in Dark Age Britain did not wash their hands before meals, nor did they properly cleanse themselves after using the toilet. The widespread filth and lack of cleanliness led to a constant cycle of infections. A simple cut or scratch could become infected, as there was no knowledge of antiseptics or proper wound care. In fact, people living in these harsh conditions were often too preoccupied with the more immediate concerns of survival to worry about hygiene. Keeping clean was a luxury they could scarcely afford. For those living in rural areas, where isolation meant even fewer resources, the situation was even worse. The absence of access to clean water and sanitation meant that life in these remote settlements was often a precarious existence. Families lived in close quarters, in small thatched-roofed huts that offered little protection from the elements. These structures, often damp and poorly ventilated, were ideal breeding grounds for diseases such as tuberculosis, which could spread like wildfire in the confined space. The constant exposure to dampness, coupled with inadequate food and lack of proper shelter, meant that people's immune systems were severely weakened, leaving them vulnerable to the many diseases that ran rampant throughout the population. Even the wealthy, who had access to better living conditions and more abundant resources, were not immune to the widespread health risks that plagued Dark Age Britain. While the nobility might have had access to cleaner water sources or more hygienic living conditions, they still had no real understanding of the importance of sanitation. Their homes were still often plagued by fleas, rats, and the risk of disease. It was not uncommon for nobles to die from the same illnesses that affected the peasants, as there was simply no reliable form of medical care or sanitary knowledge available to anyone, regardless of social class. In this world of filth and disease, life expectancy was short, and it was not uncommon for people to die young from illnesses that could have been prevented in modern times. Children, in particular, were extremely vulnerable. With their immune system still developing, they were far more likely to succumb to the various diseases that spread through the overcrowded villages and towns. Infant mortality rates were high, and it was not unusual for families to lose several children to disease before one reached adulthood. The overall lack of sanitation and hygiene in Dark Age Britain left people exposed to numerous health risks. The cycle of disease, poor water quality, and inadequate waste disposal contributed to a grim reality of constant sickness and early death. In a time when medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, the people of Britain had little recourse to protect themselves from the invisible enemies, germs, bacteria, and viruses that silently spread through their homes and communities. Disease became a constant companion, as inevitable as the changing seasons, and it defined the harsh existence of life in the Dark Ages. As if life in Dark Age Britain wasn't already fraught with dangers, the constant specter of disease loomed like an ever-present shadow, casting its deadly pall over every moment of existence. No sooner did people begin to settle into their routines dealing with the unforgiving weather, the ceaseless battle against hunger, and the ever-present risks of injury and malnutrition than they found themselves in the midst of an invisible, far more terrifying enemy. The threat of plague was not only constant, it was inescapable, leaving entire villages, towns, and even cities decimated in its wake. Without the knowledge of what caused these terrible afflictions, and without any form of treatment or preventive care, death seemed almost inevitable for those unlucky enough to encounter one of the many scourges that spread through the population. The first whispers of disaster came with the plague of Justinian, a catastrophic event that heralded the arrival of a new era of fear. This was no ordinary disease. It was the bubonic plague, a virulent, terrifying illness that struck without warning and struck hard. Its arrival in Britain, like much of Europe, was like a storm on the horizon, one that people could see coming but had no way of avoiding. The disease moved swiftly, a relentless tide of infection that surged through towns and villages, claiming lives indiscriminately and leaving little room for hope. Unlike the ailments of everyday life, the plague was an omnipresent, unavoidable force. It did not discriminate between the rich and the poor, the old and the young. Once it was set in motion, it wreaked havoc on the very fabric of society. The symptoms of the plague were horrific: a sudden fever, swollen lymph nodes, and painful boils that could grow to the size of eggs. The infected would soon find themselves gasping for breath, their bodies racked with pain as the disease quickly spread through their system. The very air seemed to carry it, invisible yet deadly, seeping into homes, marketplaces, and villages with ease. The darkness of the disease mirrored the darkness of the times, and the fear it instilled was as pervasive as the filth and decay that had become part of everyday life. People watched helplessly as their loved ones became fevered, disoriented, and died within hours or days, with no chance of recovery and no understanding of how to fight back. To survive the plague was a matter of luck. In the absence of any understanding of germ theory or sanitation, there was no clear path to protection. The idea of contagion, of disease spreading from one person to another, was an alien concept to the people of Dark Age Britain. They had no idea that the rats scurrying across their streets, leaving droppings in the dirt, or the fleas on their pets, were in fact vectors carrying the plague to the next unwitting victim. With no means of isolating the infected or preventing contact, the disease spread as quickly as it arrived. Once a town was struck, the people would scramble to contain it, but their efforts were futile. Isolating a house or burying the dead was seen as a remedy, but these were only temporary measures, and death continued its rampage across the land. Entire families and villages could be wiped out in mere weeks. The fear of infection became a constant companion, especially for those living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Living in such overcrowded environments, where there was little space for air to circulate or privacy to be maintained, made the transmission of disease almost inevitable. In rural villages, people lived in small huts, often no bigger than a few rooms, with multiple families sharing a single building. There was little to no ventilation, and the smoke from cooking fires filled the air, making the indoors a suffocating, unhealthy place. Hygiene was an afterthought. Soap was rare, and regular bathing was a luxury few could afford. If the weather allowed, people might wash themselves in rivers, but even the cleanest river was no match for the onslaught of filth that tainted everything around them. With no modern sewage systems, waste was simply discarded wherever it could be hidden behind the house, in ditches, or near the nearest stream. Human and animal waste mixed freely, creating the perfect breeding grounds for all manner of disease. In these unsanitary conditions, infection was a constant threat. The fear of plague went beyond the immediate dread of sickness. It transformed the way people thought about their daily lives. If someone in the village fell ill, their family and friends would quickly become pariahs, their home quarantined until the person's fate was decided. There was no recourse for the sick other than the prayers of the local healer or the priest, but even they had little understanding of how to cure what ailed the afflicted. In fact, much of the treatment during this period was based on superstition, herbal remedies, and potions mixed with prayers to ward off evil spirits, as though illness could be dispelled by invoking divine intervention. Bloodletting and leeching were also common practices, as doctors believed these methods could help restore balance to the body. But such treatments, though they were intended to help, often did more harm than good, weakening the body further and leaving it vulnerable to the ravages of the disease. The sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. People were acutely aware of the inevitability of death in their world, but there was no tangible solution, no cure to be found. And as the plague spread and wiped out entire families, the survivors had to contend with a world of endless mourning, where death was as familiar as waking up in the morning. Entire communities were left grieving their losses, but in the face of plague, there was little time for proper grieving. Life went on grimly, painfully, because it had to. The people of Dark Age Britain, caught in the relentless cycle of sickness, hunger, and despair, had little choice but to endure. The plague, as devastating as it was just one of many diseases that plagued the people of Britain in the Dark Ages. Each of these diseases arrived, spread, and took lives, often without warning. The same lack of medical knowledge that allowed the plague to spread made it difficult for people to recognize and fight other diseases as well. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were all common threats, each capable of wiping out large portions of the population. And while the bubonic plague stands out as one of the most feared and deadly, the constant presence of other illnesses was a backdrop to the lives of the people in this brutal age. Fear of infection was something that everyone, regardless of their social status, had to live with. Whether you were a peasant working the fields, a merchant in the town square, or a noble in your manor, no one was immune. The fear of what could be lurking unseen, the constant possibility that illness might strike at any moment, made survival even more tenuous. The uncertainty of life in Dark Age Britain wasn't just due to the threat of war, famine, or injury. It was the ever-present reality of disease and the constant dread of what the next cough, fever, or rash might bring. Ultimately, survival in this harsh world often came down to sheer luck. Whether or not you caught the plague, whether or not you were the one to contract the deadly fever that was making its way through the village, none of it could be predicted or avoided. People did their best to stay safe, to isolate themselves, to pray for protection, but death was never far off, lurking just behind the next door, the next corner. And in a world without medical knowledge, without understanding, and without hope, life was perpetually at risk. In the end, the constant threat of plague became as much a part of life in Dark Age Britain as the soil itself. It was a force beyond control, an invisible enemy that stalked every village, every town, and every home. It was not a matter of if the plague would strike, but when and who would survive to witness another day. This grim reality was the backdrop to every moment of life, shaping the thoughts, actions, and fates of the people who lived through it. Surviving in the Dark Ages was a daily battle against discomfort, where necessities that we often take for granted today were rare and sometimes absent. Life was a constant struggle to simply stay warm, to rest, and to stay alive through the harsh realities of a world without the conveniences that modern society provides. It wasn't just the uncertainty of disease, famine, or war that made life so brutal. It was the relentless discomfort that people endured day after day, making even the most mundane aspects of life feel like an impossible challenge. In the absence of proper insulation and heating, the cold was ever present in the Dark Ages. Homes were often simple structures made of wood and thatch, with no central heating, no fireplaces to ward off the chill, and no blankets to wrap around your body for warmth at night. Instead of the warmth of modern bedding, people were forced to sleep on beds made of straw or rough-hewn wooden planks, which offered little support or comfort. The warmth you had to rely on came from a fire that might burn in the center of the room, but even that would be fleeting. Firewood was precious and expensive, and it was difficult to maintain a strong enough flame to keep the cold at bay. At night, when the air grew even colder, people huddled together for warmth, often sharing small spaces with their families, livestock, and sometimes even their pets. A cow might sleep in the corner of your hut, and a goat might decide to join you under the straw bed. The mingling of human warmth and animal heat could offer some comfort, but it was hardly enough to stave off the bitter chill of a medieval winter. Many homes, even when heated, were filled with smoke, and there was no chimney to carry it away. It would swirl around the room, choking the inhabitants as they tried to sleep, their bodies stiff with cold, their noses red from the biting wind that crept in through the cracks in the walls. Sleep itself was a challenge. Without proper bedding or the warmth of a heated home, sleep was never restful. The discomfort of the straw mattress, the freezing air that nipped at your skin, and the constant noise of the animals outside or inside your home created an atmosphere where rest was never truly achieved. There were no soft pillows or cozy blankets to cushion the body. Instead, people curled up in whatever position they could, trying to find some measure of comfort in the midst of physical pain and exhaustion. The cold air seeped into your bones, leaving you restless, unable to fall into the deep, healing sleep that we take for granted today. If the cold and discomfort weren't enough, the lack of proper clothing added another layer of hardship to everyday life. Wool was often the only material available for clothing, and it was rough, itchy, and not nearly as effective at keeping the cold out as the modern fabrics we use today. Clothing was simple, functional, and often ill-fitting. Tunics, cloaks, and woolen garments were worn by most, but they provided little protection from the elements. The poor were especially vulnerable, with tattered clothing that barely offered enough warmth to survive. Leather shoes were worn by those who could afford them, but for many, their footwear consisted of makeshift boots fashioned from strips of cloth or animal hide, offering minimal protection against the mud, snow, and sharp stones of the roads. In a world where warmth and comfort were scarce, even the smallest details of everyday life became a challenge. The act of eating was a struggle as well. You would sit down to a meager meal of porridge perhaps, or a thin stew made from whatever scraps could be found, but there was no warmth to the food. It was often cold by the time it reached your hands, and the harshness of the day left your stomach empty, aching for something more. There were no modern conveniences like stoves or microwaves. The cooking process involved tending to an open fire, with food placed in pots or cauldrons above it. But without proper insulation, the food could easily burn, leaving you with little to sustain yourself. The constant struggle for warmth, food, and rest was compounded by the noise and chaos of everyday life. There were no quiet, peaceful nights in a comfortable home. The constant clamor of the outside world, dogs barking, chickens crowing, neighbors arguing, or the occasional cry of a child kept you alert even in the dead of night. There was no escape from the noise, no sanctuary to retreat to after a long, exhausting day. The peace and solitude we seek at the end of a long workday were foreign concepts in the Dark Ages. People didn't just sleep in discomfort. They lived in it. The relentless cold, the lack of rest, and the constant hum of life created a sense of resignation. There was no hope for warmth, no hope for comfort. In fact, the concept of comfort itself was virtually non-existent. People lived with the understanding that their lives would be hard, and there would be no reprieve. The cold that gnawed at their skin was a constant reminder of the fragility of existence. It was a world where survival itself was the ultimate goal, and everything else, warmth, comfort, leisure, was an unattainable luxury. Even the few moments of peace that came with a meal or a brief rest could not be fully enjoyed because of the discomfort that always lingered in the background. The joy of family life was often overshadowed by the struggle for survival, and the sense of warmth that comes from a loving home was often replaced by the harshness of reality. Without modern comforts, the Dark Ages were a time of physical suffering and emotional endurance. In this world, comfort wasn't something that could be worked for or achieved. It was something that simply didn't exist. When the night fell and people finally settled into their straw beds, the discomforts of the day did not end. The cold seeped in through the walls. The roof leaked in places, and the sounds of the outside world never ceased. There were no quiet nights, no restful sleep, no warmth. Instead, there was the heavy weight of exhaustion, the constant tension between body and environment, and the relentless awareness that tomorrow would bring another day of hardship. In a world so focused on survival, the concept of comfort was nothing more than a distant dream, a dream that the people of Dark Age Britain could never reach. Every day was a fight for survival, every night a struggle for warmth and rest. And while we may romanticize the past today, imagining a time of simplicity and closeness to nature, the truth of life in the Dark Ages was one of constant discomfort, fear, and hardship. It was a world where every day was a battle, not for riches or luxury, but simply for the ability to survive until the next day. Surviving in the Dark Ages was a daily battle against discomfort, where necessities that we often take for granted today were rare and sometimes absent. Life was a constant struggle to simply stay warm, to rest, and to stay alive through the harsh realities of a world without the conveniences that modern society provides. It wasn't just the uncertainty of disease, famine, or war that made life so brutal. It was the relentless discomfort that people endured day after day, making even the most mundane aspects of life feel like an impossible challenge. In the absence of proper insulation and heating, the cold was ever present in the Dark Ages. Homes were often simple structures made of wood and thatch, with no central heating, no fireplaces to ward off the chill, and no blankets to wrap around your body for warmth at night. Instead of the warmth of modern bedding, people were forced to sleep on beds made of straw or rough-hewn wooden planks, which offered little support or comfort. The warmth you had to rely on came from a fire that might burn in the center of the room, but even that would be fleeting. Firewood was precious and expensive, and it was difficult to maintain a strong enough flame to keep the cold at bay. At night, when the air grew even colder, people huddled together for warmth, often sharing small spaces with their families, livestock, and sometimes even their pets. A cow might sleep in the corner of your hut, and a goat might decide to join you under the straw bed. The mingling of human warmth and animal heat could offer some comfort, but it was hardly enough to stave off the bitter chill of a medieval winter. Many homes, even when heated, were filled with smoke, and there was no chimney to carry it away. It would swirl around the room, choking the inhabitants as they tried to sleep, their bodies stiff with cold, their noses red from the biting wind that crept in through the cracks in the walls. Sleep itself was a challenge. Without proper bedding or the warmth of a heated home, sleep was never restful. The discomfort of the straw mattress, the freezing air that nipped at your skin, and the constant noise of the animals outside or inside your home created an atmosphere where rest was never truly achieved. There were no soft pillows or cozy blankets to cushion the body. Instead, people curled up in whatever position they could, trying to find some measure of comfort in the midst of physical pain and exhaustion. The cold air seeped into your bones, leaving you restless, unable to fall into the deep, healing sleep that we take for granted today. If the cold and discomfort weren't enough, the lack of proper clothing added another layer of hardship to everyday life. Wool was often the only material available for clothing, and it was rough, itchy, and not nearly as effective at keeping the cold out as the modern fabrics we use today. Clothing was simple, functional, and often ill-fitting. Tunics, cloaks, and woolen garments were worn by most, but they provided little protection from the elements. The poor were especially vulnerable, with tattered clothing that barely offered enough warmth to survive. Leather shoes were worn by those who could afford them, but for many, their footwear consisted of makeshift boots fashioned from strips of cloth or animal hide, offering minimal protection against the mud, snow, and sharp stones of the roads. In a world where warmth and comfort were scarce, even the smallest details of everyday life became a challenge. The act of eating was a struggle as well. You would sit down to a meager meal of porridge, perhaps, or a thin stew made from whatever scraps could be found, but there was no warmth to the food. It was often cold by the time it reached your hands, and the harshness of the day left your stomach empty, aching for something more. There were no modern conveniences like stoves or microwaves. The cooking process involved tending to an open fire, with food placed in pots or cauldrons above it. But without proper insulation, the food could easily burn, leaving you with little to sustain yourself. The constant struggle for warmth, food, and rest was compounded by the noise and chaos of everyday life. There were no quiet, peaceful nights in a comfortable home. The constant clamor of the outside world, dogs barking, chickens crowing, neighbors arguing, or the occasional cry of a child kept you alert even in the dead of night. There was no escape from the noise, no sanctuary to retreat to after a long, exhausting day. The peace and solitude we seek at the end of a long workday were foreign concepts in the Dark Ages. People didn't just sleep in discomfort, they lived in it. The relentless cold, the lack of rest, and the constant hum of life created a sense of resignation. There was no hope for warmth, no hope for comfort. In fact, the concept of comfort itself was virtually non-existent. People lived with the understanding that their lives would be hard and there would be no reprieve. The cold that gnawed at their skin was a constant reminder of the fragility of existence. It was a world where survival itself was the ultimate goal, and everything else, warmth, comfort, leisure, was an unattainable luxury. Even the few moments of peace that came with a meal or a brief rest could not be fully enjoyed because of the discomfort that always lingered in the background. The joy of family life was often overshadowed by the struggle for survival, and the sense of warmth that comes from a loving home was often replaced by the harshness of reality. Without modern comforts, the Dark Ages were a time of physical suffering and emotional endurance. In this world, comfort wasn't something that could be worked for or achieved. It was something that simply didn't exist. When the night fell and people finally settled into their straw beds, the discomforts of the day did not end. The cold seeped in through the walls, the roof leaked in places, and the sounds of the outside world never ceased. There were no quiet nights, no restful sleep, no warmth. Instead, there was the heavy weight of exhaustion, the constant tension between body and environment, and the relentless awareness that tomorrow would bring another day of hardship. In a world so focused on survival, the concept of comfort was nothing more than a distant dream, a dream that the people of Dark Age Britain could never reach. Every day was a fight for survival, every night a struggle for warmth and rest. And while we may romanticize the past today, imagining a time of simplicity and closeness to nature, the truth of life in the Dark Ages was one of constant discomfort, fear, and hardship. It was a world where every day was a battle, not for riches or luxury, but simply for the ability to survive until the next day. In Dark Age Britain, The concept of personal liberty and legal rights was foreign to the vast majority of the population. Unlike the modern world, where individuals have a voice, the ability to defend themselves in court, and rights protected by law, the people of this time lived in a rigid, feudal society. Their survival and freedom were dictated by the whims of their lords and landowners. To be a serf or peasant in the Dark Ages meant that you had no real say in your own fate. Your life was controlled by the land you worked on, the people who owned it, and the forces that governed the feudal system. If you weren't born into nobility, then your worth was tied to the land you worked. Serfdom was the cruel reality for the majority of the population. You were born into your station and had no legal rights or protections to escape it. A serf was considered the property of the landowner, bound to the estate, with no freedom to choose their own path. The work was grueling, the rewards minimal, and there was no escaping the cycle of labor that dictated your every move. Your lord owned the land, and through a complex system of obligations and duties, he owned you. Even if you had an ounce of ambition, the rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system was too strong to break. Being a serf meant that your life was dictated by the decisions of someone who could be a stranger, a tyrant, or a benevolent lord. There was little in between. You lived in the shadow of their power, constantly at their mercy. Your survival depended not on your own efforts or intelligence, but on whether your lord decided to be kind or cruel, whether he wanted to grant you some meager reward for your labor, or whether he would extract every ounce of energy from you for his own benefit. Serfs were often required to work long hours in the fields, with little time to rest or recover. You had no recourse if you were overworked, abused, or mistreated. You could appeal to the church or the crown, but those avenues were often either inaccessible or ineffective, as both were more concerned with maintaining the feudal structure than with protecting the rights of peasants. The abuse of power by lords and landowners was a common and harsh reality in Dark Age Britain. As a serf, you had no voice, no rights, and no way to seek justice if you were mistreated. Lords, who held all the power in the land, could easily take advantage of their position. If a lord took an interest in a young woman or needed laborers for personal gain, there was nothing to stop him from exploiting his serfs. Sexual abuse, forced labor, and physical punishment were all too common. In many cases, serfs had no way to challenge their lord's decisions or actions. They had no law to protect them, no legal system in place to ensure their basic dignity was respected. If you were lucky, your lord would be fair, providing you with land to farm and a roof over your head in exchange for your labor. But luck was a rare commodity in this harsh world. Far more often, serfs were worked to the bone, forced to hand over the fruits of their labor to their masters without compensation. This exploitation extended not only to their work, but to their very livelihoods. If your lord demanded more crops from you than you could grow, or if a poor harvest left you without food, there was nothing you could do to change your circumstances. You could starve, and your lord would take what little you had left, leaving you with nothing but the promise of more labor in exchange for your survival. The lack of legal protection made it impossible for peasants to fight back. If a lord abused his power, there was no court to turn to for justice. Serfs could not go to the law to defend themselves, as the law itself was intertwined with the aristocratic structure. Even if a serf were subjected to physical violence or theft, there was little to be done beyond enduring the cruelty, as the legal system was designed to protect the landowners, not the laborers. If a lord chose to confiscate your property or land, there was no recourse for you. His word was law, and you had no legal standing to oppose him. This system of unchallenged power was a source of constant fear for those living under it. Serfs lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, knowing that their survival depended on the whims of their lord. Even a simple disagreement or a poorly executed task could result in harsh punishment. The threat of retribution hung over every peasant, knowing that any misstep could lead to the loss of their land, their food, or even their life. The brutality of the feudal system left people vulnerable to abuse, with no protection from those in power who could easily exploit their position. There were no labor laws, no unions, no protections for workers, and no mechanism to ensure that those in power would be held accountable for their actions. Without education or legal knowledge, Most serfs had no understanding of their own rights, if such rights existed in the first place. Many were raised in ignorance, with little understanding of the world beyond their lord's estate. This lack of awareness made it even more difficult for them to fight against the power structures that ruled over them. They were taught to obey, to work, and to serve without question. Rebellion, when it did happen, was often brutally suppressed, with entire villages or regions being punished for the actions of a few brave individuals who dared to rise. Even though the feudal system relied on the labor of the peasantry, the lives of the serfs were considered expendable. Lords saw them as property, and their worth was measured by how much work they could provide. If a serf died or became too ill to work, they were replaced. Life was cheap in the Dark Ages, and serfs were the most expendable members of society. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how loyal they were, they had no power to change their circumstances. The absence of legal rights or protections for peasants meant that their lives were filled with uncertainty, fear, and hardship. Even when serfs managed to build a small amount of wealth or gain a sense of security, it was always at risk of being taken away by their lord. Their lives were not their own. The decisions made by their masters determined their fate. In the Dark Ages, survival was often a matter of luck and circumstance, and for the majority of people, it was a long and difficult struggle under the weight of a system that offered them no protection. This brutal reality shaped the lives of peasants for generations. It wasn't just a lack of rights that kept them oppressed, it was the constant reminder that their survival was at the mercy of those in power, with no guarantee of justice, no possibility of escape, and no hope for change. The feudal system kept people bound, not just by land and labor, but by the ever-present threat of exploitation and abuse. In the Dark Ages, the serfs had no voice and no chance at a better life. Their only hope was survival, and that was never guaranteed. As the day began to shift, marking the end of another uncertain season, the villagers would look up at the sky, watching the way the sun seemed to linger at the horizon. Time wasn't a concept they grasped in the way we understand it today. There were no clocks, no calendars, and no structured notion of a workday. Time flowed in a way that was tied to the seasons, the cycles of nature, and the unpredictability of the weather. There were no precise hours, no ticking hands to guide your life. Instead, each day felt like it could be the same as the next, stretching endlessly into a blur of tasks and survival. If you asked the villagers what time it was, you might get an answer as vague as, "The sun's still high," or, "It's after the evening meal." The day was divided by the rhythms of labor, the movement of the sun, and the needs of the moment. In a world where survival was the primary focus, the concept of time as we know it didn't hold much value. Life was dictated by nature's forces. Without the constant push of modern deadlines or clocks reminding you to move from one task to the next, people were left to navigate their existence with a sense of freedom that, in truth, was also limiting. The uncertainty of time mirrored the uncertainty of life. You worked when you had to, rested when you could, and awaited the changing of the seasons like a silent observer in the vast, shifting natural world around you. There were no appointed workdays, no rigid schedules defining when the work began and when it ended. Each task, each responsibility, was framed not by an hour but by the urgency of its necessity. The agricultural cycles, the planting and harvesting of crops, and the tending of livestock, all of these tasks depended on the weather and the seasons. One might toil from dawn until dusk, but the length of the day was not measured in hours. It was measured by how much could be done before the sky darkened, before the cold winds blew in, or before the rain began to fall. Farmers, the majority of the population, kept time by the land and the weather. The harvest was the pinnacle of the year, but its success was never guaranteed. If the rains were too heavy or too scarce, the crops might fail, leaving the farmers with little to show for their labor. The winter months, when the cold crept into every corner of the house and the nights grew long, were just as uncertain. When food was scarce, when the weather kept you from working outside, people huddled together, praying for better days, uncertain when the thaw would come or when spring would truly arrive. Without the tools to measure the passage of time, such as the clocks that would later define the rhythms of modern society, people in the Dark Ages used nature's cues to define their lives. The seasons provided a rhythm, though it was hardly dependable. Winter could stretch for what seemed like eternity, with no relief in sight. The arrival of spring, while hoped for, was never guaranteed. People relied on the cycles of nature, on the movements of the stars, and on the changes they observed in the environment. The arrival of migratory birds or the first signs of bloom on trees were more than signs of a changing season. They were markers of survival. You didn't wait for a day on a calendar to tell you the planting season had arrived. You looked at the sky, at the earth, and at the animals that surrounded you. At the same time, the absence of a structured understanding of time left people with a profound sense of instability. Without clocks or schedules, life often felt like a continuous cycle of waiting for the next season, the next rain, or the next day to unfold. This sense of impermanence was a constant undercurrent. The uncertainty of time mirrored the uncertainty of life itself. When the next winter storm could freeze everything in place, when a famine could strike unexpectedly, when disease could ravage an entire village, time became a luxury you couldn't afford to understand. Your focus was on surviving, on finding enough food, on keeping the animals safe, and on making it through the night. There was no way of knowing how long the current season would last. Would it be a long, wet spring that delayed planting, or a short, dry one that sped up the harvest but also risked famine? The villagers lived in a constant state of preparation, their lives dictated by forces they couldn't control. Time didn't flow in neat, predictable blocks. It stretched and contracted, like the seasons themselves. You couldn't predict when it would rain, when it would snow, or when the crops would grow. And if you survived one season, you could only hope the next would be kinder. The uncertainty extended beyond the land and the seasons. Life in the Dark Ages was defined by its lack of security in every sense. Without the ability to measure time with accuracy, it was difficult to plan, to create, or to prepare for what came next. What could a person truly plan for when there were no clocks to mark the hours, no written records to mark the days, no way to measure the year? Without the certainty of time, you lived not with the assumption that you would grow older, but with the knowledge that every day was a gift that might be taken away. The concept of aging, too, was often vague. People did not live in a world where birthdays were celebrated, where one could mark their age by years. In the absence of records and with no concept of standardized timekeeping, people didn't necessarily know when they were born, and if they did, it was often a vague calculation based on the passing seasons. Some might celebrate their birthdays based on a rough estimation of when they were born, but these celebrations were few, often focused more on survival than on marking milestones. Life in the Dark Ages was about endurance, not about counting years. The only way people understood the passage of time was by the progress of the seasons and the cycles of life itself: birth, work, aging, and death. The march of time was felt in these cycles, but a numerical understanding did not define it. People were guided by nature, not clocks. The uncertainty of time in the Dark Ages meant that you never quite knew what to expect. But strangely, this uncertainty also brought a sense of resilience. You learned to adapt to the unpredictable, to survive despite the lack of structure, to be flexible in your understanding of time, and your ability to endure whatever challenges life brought. This made the lives of people in the Dark Ages both fragile and strong. Fragile in their inability to control their future or understand their place in a world that was governed by forces far beyond their control. Strong in their ability to survive year after year, not by a precise understanding of the passing time, but through the ability to endure whatever was thrown their way. Time, in this sense, was a friend and an enemy, something that you had no control over but which defined every aspect of your life. The uncertainty of time meant that people lived in a constant state of adaptation, learning to rely on the most immediate and tangible aspects of life: the weather, the seasons, the signs of nature to guide their survival. There were no certainties, no clear paths ahead. Time moved in a way that was constantly shifting, and the lives of the people living through it were defined by that uncertainty. As we reflect on the struggles faced by those living in Dark Age Britain, it becomes clear that survival during this time was not a simple or easy task. Life in this era was defined by unrelenting hardship and constant threats from every corner. The absence of modern conveniences, the lack of medical care, and the ever-present dangers of disease, violence, and starvation created an environment where every day was a fight for survival. In this world, death was always looming, and the fragility of life was palpable. People did not live in the comfort we know today. There were no promises of tomorrow, no assurances that the sun would rise on a better day. The people of Dark Age Britain lived in a perpetual state of uncertainty, where each moment was marked by a fight to hold on to life. The shadow of illness, hunger, and violence hung over them constantly, and yet they pressed on. There was no easy escape from the harshness of the world they inhabited. Disease could strike at any time, whether from the unsanitary conditions they lived in or the lack of proper medical care. Famine, too, was always a threat, with the weather dictating the fate of the harvest and, by extension, the survival of entire villages. In the face of these overwhelming hardships, survival became the only goal. People did not live for the sake of living. They lived simply because they had no choice. They endured because the alternative was worse death. Life, in many ways, was cheap during the Dark Ages. There was no luxury, no comfort, and certainly no security. Everything from food to shelter to safety was uncertain, and survival was a constant struggle. Theirs was not a life of ease or joy, but one of sheer persistence. Each day survived was an accomplishment in itself, and each day that passed was a reminder of just how fragile life really was. Yet, amidst all this hardship, there existed a quiet strength in the people of Dark Age Britain. It wasn't the strength of great warriors or heroic figures. It wasn't the kind of strength that would fill history books with tales of battle and victory. No, their strength was in their endurance, in the ability to keep moving forward despite the overwhelming odds. It was not a strength born of power or wealth, but one born of necessity. These people lived in a world where each day was a struggle, where survival was not a matter of choice but of fate. They woke up each morning to a world full of disease, hunger, and violence. Yet they faced it with an unwavering determination to simply survive. There was no room for weakness in this world, but there was space for resilience. And it was this quiet endurance that allowed them to keep going, day after day, despite the odds stacked against them. They didn't live to thrive. They lived because they had no choice. This endurance was not loud or dramatic. It wasn't a grand display of strength or power. It was quiet, persistent, and unyielding. They survived not because they were strong, but because they had to. Life was not kind to them, but they didn't stop. They didn't give up. They woke up every day, even when the day before had been just as difficult, and they kept going. In many ways, this quiet endurance is a more remarkable strength than any kind of physical power or bravado. It is the ability to face hardship, to face death, and to keep pushing forward despite it all. It is the strength to survive when survival itself is the only option. And in this quiet endurance, we see something truly extraordinary, a resilience that cannot be broken by the world around them. This is the legacy of the people who lived in the Dark Ages. They may not have been remembered for their great achievements or for the comforts they enjoyed, but they were remembered for their ability to survive. They endured the unendurable, lived through the unlivable, and kept going when others might have given up. And that, in itself, is an achievement of the highest order. As we close tonight's tale, let us remember that survival in the Dark Ages was not about living in comfort or joy. It was about simply scraping by, getting through another day, and continuing to exist despite the odds. It was not about thriving or succeeding, it was about enduring. Every day was a challenge, every night a struggle. But despite it all, the people of the Dark Ages kept going. They didn't give up, not because they were immune to the surrounding hardships, but because they had no choice but to press on. In a world where every day was a fight for survival, their strength lay not in their victories, but in their ability to simply endure. It wasn't the loud, heroic strength we often think of when we imagine warriors or leaders. It was the strength of the common people, the ones who lived through the muck and mire of daily life, who fought battles not with swords, but with the very act of living. Let us take a moment tonight to honor the resilience of those who lived through such a tough era. Their lives were marked by struggle, but they were also marked by strength. The strength to endure, to survive, and to keep going when everything else seemed impossible. As we lay our heads down tonight, let us remember that survival is sometimes the greatest triumph of all. The people of the Dark Ages endured because they had to, and in their quiet endurance, they set an example for all of us. So, as we drift off to sleep, may their perseverance inspire us. In a world where we often complain about the smallest inconveniences, let us remember that survival, true survival, is about more than thriving. It's about making it through another day, about enduring the hardships, and about finding strength in the quiet moments of resilience. Let this story be a lullaby for us all, reminding us of the power of endurance and the quiet strength that lives within each of us.